morning sun cast long shadows across the prairie grass as Samuel Hartwell rode his weathered bay mare along the familiar path that led to town. At 62 years old, he had traveled this route countless times over the past 30 years since settling on his small ranch in the Nebraska Territory. The rhythmic sound of hoofbeats on packed earth provided a steady comfort that matched the gentle sway of his body in the saddle. Samuel was a man of simple pleasures and honest work. His hands bore the permanent stains of leather and hay, and his face carried the deep lines that came from squinting into prairie sunsets and weathering harsh winters. He had built his life one fence post at a time, one season at a time, with the patience that only comes to those who understand that some things cannot be rushed. The wagon wheels creaking ahead caught his attention first. Then he heard something that made his blood run cold in his veins. A woman's voice carried on the wind, thin and desperate with fear. "Please don't," she cried, and there was something in that plea that spoke of terror beyond anything Samuel had encountered in all his years on the frontier. He urged his mare forward and crested the small hill that had blocked his view of the road ahead. What he saw there made him pull back sharply on the reins, and his horse danced nervously beneath him, sensing the tension that suddenly filled her rider's body. Below him on the dusty trail sat an overturned wagon, its contents scattered across the ground like broken dreams. A young woman lay sprawled beside it, her white dress torn and stained with what looked like blood. Her long auburn hair was matted against her face, and one arm hung at an unnatural angle. Standing over her was a man Samuel didn't recognize, a stranger with the hard look of someone who had traveled far from civilized places. The woman's eyes found Samuel's across the distance, and in them he saw the kind of desperate hope that breaks a man's heart if he doesn't act upon it immediately. She tried to speak again, but only a whisper emerged from her lips. Samuel had never considered himself a brave man. He was a rancher who preferred the company of cattle and horses to most people. He had lived through the Civil War not as a hero, but as someone who simply did what needed doing each day until the terrible business was finished. Now, at this moment, he felt that same familiar weight of necessity settling onto his shoulders. The stranger looked up as Samuel approached, and there was something in the man's face that spoke of violence barely held in check. His clothes were dusty from travel, and his eyes held the cold calculation of someone who viewed other people as obstacles rather than fellow human beings. "Move along, old man." The stranger called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "This ain't your concern." Samuel brought his horse to a stop about 20 feet away, close enough to see the fear in the young woman's eyes, but far enough to react if the situation turned dangerous. He had learned long ago that sometimes the most important conversations happen in the space between words. "Looks like the lady might need some help," Samuel said, keeping his voice steady and calm. He had discovered over the years that a quiet tone could often accomplish more than shouting ever could. The stranger's hand moved instinctively toward the gun at his hip, but something in Samuel's bearing gave him pause. Perhaps it was the older man's complete lack of fear, or maybe it was the way Samuel sat his horse with the easy confidence of someone who had faced down charging bulls and prairie storms without flinching. "I said move along," the stranger repeated, but this time there was less certainty in his voice. Samuel dismounted slowly, deliberately taking his time as he tied his horse's reins to a nearby scrub oak. Every movement was calculated to show that he had no intention of leaving this scene until the matter was resolved properly. "Ma'am," he called to the woman without taking his eyes off the stranger. "Are you hurt badly?" The woman's voice came out in a broken whisper. "My leg," she managed to say. "I think it's broken." Then, with more strength born of desperation, she added, "He was trying to, but she couldn't finish the sentence." Samuel nodded, understanding passing between them without need for further explanation. In his years of living, he had encountered men who viewed others as possessions to be taken rather than people to be respected. The knowledge of what might have happened here if he hadn't come along filled him with a quiet anger that ran deeper than any loud rage ever could. "Here's what we're going to do," Samuel said, addressing both the stranger and the woman. "I'm going to help this lady get to town where she can see the doctor. You're going to gather up her belongings that got scattered when the wagon overturned, and you're going to help me load them onto my horse." The stranger laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "You're out of your mind, old man. I could put 3 bullets in you before you even knew what happened." Samuel had heard similar threats before during his war years and in the rough early days of settling the territory. He had learned that men who talked about violence the most were often the least likely to follow through when faced with someone who refused to be intimidated. Maybe you could, Samuel agreed, but then you'd have to explain to the sheriff in town why there's a dead rancher on the road next to an injured woman. Folks tend to remember faces around here, and I'm betting someone saw you riding this direction. Wasn't true about anyone seeing the stranger, but Samuel had discovered that uncertainty could be a powerful weapon when wielded properly. He watched as doubt crept into the other man's eyes. The woman tried to sit up despite her obvious pain. "Please," she said, looking directly at Samuel. "My name is Margaret O'Brien. I was traveling to Nebraska City to meet my fiancé. This man," she gestured weakly toward the stranger, "he said he was going to help me fix my wagon wheel, but then That's enough." The stranger snapped, but his earlier confidence was beginning to crack around the edges. Samuel knelt beside Margaret, careful not to jar her injured leg. Up close, he could see that she was younger than he had first thought, probably no more than 25, with the kind of clear blue eyes that spoke of Irish heritage and determination. Her dress was indeed torn and stained, but as he looked more carefully, he realized that much of what he had taken for blood was actually dirt and mud from the overturned wagon. "Miss O'Brien," he said gently, "I'm Samuel Hartwell, and I give you my word that no further harm will come to you today. Can you tell me where else you might be hurt besides your leg?" Margaret's relief at finding someone willing to help her was evident in every word she spoke. "My arm hurts terribly, and I hit my head when the wagon went over, but I think I'll be all right if I can just get to a doctor." Samuel stood and faced the stranger again. "What's your name, son?" The question seemed to surprise the other man. "What does it matter?" "It matters because I'm going to remember it, and so is Miss O'Brien here. When we get to town, people are going to ask what happened, and we're going to tell them. Now you can either be remembered as the man who helped a lady in distress after her accident, or as something else entirely. The choice is yours." For a long moment, the only sounds were the prairie wind rustling through the grass and the distant call of a meadowlark. Samuel waited, knowing that sometimes the most important battles are won not through force, but through giving people the opportunity to choose the better path. "Thomas." The stranger finally said, "Thomas Brennan." "Well, Thomas Brennan." Samuel replied, "I think you know what the right thing to do here is. Help me get Miss O'Brien's things gathered up, and then you can be on your way. No one needs to know about whatever you were planning before I came along." The transformation that came over Thomas was subtle, but unmistakable. The hard edges in his face softened slightly, and his shoulders lost some of their aggressive tension. Perhaps it was the way Samuel had given him a chance to redeem himself without humiliation, or maybe it was simply the recognition that his original plan had been foolish and dangerous. Together, the two men collected Margaret's scattered belongings from where they had spilled when her wagon overturned. There were clothes and books, a small leather case that probably contained letters from home, and various household items that spoke of a young woman setting out to build a new life in the frontier. Samuel fashioned a makeshift splint for Margaret's leg using strips of cloth from her torn petticoat and pieces of wood from the broken wagon. His movements were gentle and sure, the result of years spent caring for injured animals on his ranch. He had learned long ago that healing required not just skill, but patience and kindness. As they worked, Thomas spoke quietly to Margaret. "I want you to know, ma'am, that I'm sorry for frightening you. I haven't been thinking clearly lately, and that's no excuse, but it's the truth. You didn't deserve to be scared like that." Margaret looked at him with eyes that held caution, but also something that might have been forgiveness. "We all make mistakes, Mr. Brennan. What matters is what we do after we recognize them." Samuel helped Margaret onto his horse, settling her as comfortably as possible for the ride to town. The sun was climbing higher now, and the morning was growing warm with the promise of a beautiful day ahead. Sometimes he reflected the prairie had a way of making even difficult situations seem manageable under its vast open sky. "Thomas," he said as they prepared to part ways, "there's always work to be found for a man willing to do an honest day's labor. If you're looking to make a fresh start, there are rancha."